Welcome to the Day Friday. My name is Michael Olschimke. I'm the CEO of Scalefree. We run this show here every Friday, 11 o'clock Central European Standard Time, to allow you, the audience, to ask questions about data vault, cloud computing, anything big data, Hadoop, anything works, right? You can use the chat here. You can use the Q&A function in the client to raise your questions. You can also raise your hand if you want to raise a live question. And you can also use a form, which I'm going to show you the link for after today's session, essentially. If you receive multiple questions, I would cherry pick, right? So there's no legal obligation to answer every question here. And I should better not. And then it's time box. So it's typically a 10-minute video, 15-minute video roughly for a good YouTube video, essentially. If there would be no questions at all, I will talk about the cluster, but which is here in my basement, right? So yeah. And but typically we have enough questions at the moment, so it's all good. All right, and we had a question today's, so at Scalefree every Friday, we have this consulting Joe Fix, if you want, where all the consultants come together and we discuss what's going on, right? And one of the consultants raised a question essentially from a project in the field where he's assigned to, and let me just show you a short slide I created for that. So the challenge is that they're creating a bridge table, which is quite large, essentially many columns. I don't know, let's say tens of columns, right? Essentially for presenting metric values, KPI values. And they're creating this bridge table over a series of sprints. So by sprint, they're adding more and more measure values to this bridge table for the later fact entity, essentially. And the challenge is that they have essentially already a massive SQL script to load this bridge table with all these KPIs, 800 plus lines of code. KPIs could also leverage the results from other KPIs. So there's also some, let's say, some dependency on the measure values. And the question is now, and the problem is when they develop this bridge table for the fact entity layer, when they develop this bridge table sprint by sprint, they have to modify this, re-engineer this massive SQL code, which becomes bigger and bigger over time, right? But on the other hand, if you consider the Data Vault Bootcamp, the training, we talked about zero change impact, zero code impact, when your changes will not impact existing code at all. That should be desired. So today's session, I called essentially bridge table and zero code impact to have a real challenge here. All right, so how do we solve this? And the idea is that we have something in a book which is not very much used by many people, to be honest, but it's quite useful in my opinion. So there's what we call the computed aggregate link. Let me just write this down. Computed. Yeah, my handwriting is not the best, but I think you get the message. So the computed aggregate link is essentially, to some extent, similar to a bridge table. However, well, first of all, it's a link which is computed. Therefore, it's part of the business vault. But we applied before the bridge table. So let's say you have in the raw data vault, you have a hub customer, you have a hub store, and a hub product. That's what you have. And there is some link that essentially provides you the retail transactions, customers walking into stores, purchasing products. Let's say there's a non-historized link for the purchases that relates all these hub references essentially. Now, the first thing you do for bridge table, for example, is that you perform the grain shift. So let's say your users would like to have only the customers and the products essentially in the target granularity. So you could create directly a bridge table, but then you will face a problem and you have to calculate all these KPIs. You're modifying this bridge table all the time. And let's start from a solution perspective. Let's start with a solution where we discuss load change impact first, okay? And then we go for zero, because let's start with low, because I think that's the best solution for most people. So instead of creating a bridge table for the grain shift, what we do is we create a computed aggregate link. It's called this CAL, computed aggregate link purchases. And that link is essentially the grain shift. So what we do is we create only those products and customer hub references are included in this link table. And then For the KPI calculations, remember a bridge table would also include the KPI values. The compute aggregate link could do this as well, but you could also have just a compute satellite attached to it. So for every measure value, I'm creating, or let's say a set of measure values, I would create a compute satellite and attach it now to the granularity. So let's say I have a compute satellite for, I don't know, the revenues. I'm attaching it here. That's the arrow. Oh gosh. Okay. Then we have a compute satellite for, let's say, profits. And so on. Well, first of all, you see that you can extend now the solution by adding more and more KPI values over time. So you just add more satellites over time. And then for a low change impact solution, what you create is a bridge table where you essentially join the granularity from the compute aggregate link down here with those satellites for the compute measure values. That's what you join into the bridge table. And yeah, you have to modify the bridge, but the bridge is just a joining of all these measure values over time. So the SQL becomes much more smaller. You get smaller artifacts for your KPI values, not these 800 lines of code in one loading procedure for bridge table. No, you get many smaller pieces, smaller compute satellites where you can focus your calculations on a set of measure values. You can cascade these compute satellites, right? So there could be another compute satellite attached to the same parent, Rev2, I don't know, which is essentially based from a loading perspective, based on this satellite. So you can cascade those compute satellites a lot, just what we do in a typical business world design anyway, right? So we do cascading business rules. So you stick to all this design, and then you just join everything together into your bridge table design. And that code for the bridge loading process, you have to modify when you add another satellite. So when you create one more satellite down here, CSX, you have to modify this code here to span across this new satellite as well. That's the load change that you have to do essentially. But gives you a relatively nice design. I believe it will be sufficient. I would materialize the bridge table. That's the purpose. The bridge table should materialize the grain shift. That's what we all said, right? The compute aggregate link and the compute satellites, you could decide not to materialize, just virtualize them, because the bridge will materialize everything, right? So that's what I would typically, right? Now, that's the load change impact solution for building a bridge over time in a more agile fashion. That's what we do. What about a zero change impact? If you say, well, everything I do, when I add more measures over time, not the grain shift, but the when you decide to change the grain shift, you modify the grain shift, I would create a new bridge table in a zero code impact solution or scenario. So when you modify the grain shift, create a new bridge table. Again, the purpose of the bridge table is to capture the grain shift, and per grain shift operation, you have one bridge table anyway. But when you add KPIs over time, this will not work because you have to essentially modify the bridge loading process here, right? You have to join all these satellites, and that's a change impact. If you want to turn this into zero, you just pivotize the table. So in your bridge table design, instead of creating one wide bridge table where you have some, let's say, hub references for customer, hub reference for product, and then the KPIs, KPI 1, KPI 2, and so on, you just pivotize it. By having the KPI name, that's a P, right? And KPI value. So same game here, customer A walks in, purchases product B, and then the revenue is 5, and so on. And the profit is 6 for A and B as well. That's the idea. Because then you can just add the measure values. When you add more and more measure values over time, you just add them to the bridge table. You just keep loading them essentially. Let me just go back. You stick to the same design here on the business world, right? Except for a bridge loading process. That's where you pivotize it. You add the measure values to satellites. And when you load the bridge table, you essentially create one insert statement per source satellite, or per measure actually, not just because a satellite could have multiple measure values, right? But per measure you want to load into a bridge, you create one independent insert statement into the bridge table. You don't unionize that, please. Just run them in parallel. Because then you can just add another compute satellite with some more KPIs, another set of insert statements into the bridge table from the new satellite, and just run everything without modifying and touching any existing code. That's the zero change impact solution. But yeah, it requires to pivotize the bridge table, which you need later to unpivotize. So there's some drawback. And that's why I believe that the more pragmatic approach with less change impact or low change impact is acceptable for most clients, because then they have this nicer, quicker design for a wider bridge table where all the KPIs are arranged to the fact, essentially. That's typically the desired format. But it also depends on your dashboarding tool and so on, which one is the best or desired solution. But that's the idea. That's what I would suggest for Lorenz in the project. So, all right, cool. But good question. If you have a question like this, oh, sorry, not end. Share my screen. 1 second. Yeah, go for this form. https://sfr.ee/dvfriday. To submit your question, you can upload some white paper, whiteboard photographs or something, or team pictures, whatever, if you think it's appropriate to deliver the essence of your question, essentially. Also check out scalefree.to/webinars, because that's where you find some additional webinars on dbt and Wescape from our consultants. And let's double check, sorry. And I see some questions. Oh, perfect. And yeah, that's where you find some additional webinars just like this, once a month at least. And they discuss essentially some tips and tricks on dbt and Wescape. Other than that, I hope to see you next Friday. Enjoy your weekend. See you guys next Friday. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining today. If you'd like to discuss this further, give us a call on the number below here, and we're happy to discuss this with you. See you next time. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.